Welcome to the official Finovate podcast with Greg Palmer. In 2007, Finovate set out to create a dynamic fintech showcase featuring live 7-minute demos. For more than a decade, our global event series has brought together tens of thousands of people from across the fintech spectrum to see cutting-edge technologies. Now you can find out what goes on behind the scenes as key influencers and innovators share the stories that they don't get to tell you from stage. Here's a glimpse of what we have in store this episode.
I looked around my community and I said, wow, there are so many people like me that are really struggling with finding the right type of capital for where we are in life.
And now, your host, Greg Palmer.
Thank you for tuning in to the Finovate podcast. This is Greg Palmer, your host. Joining me today, we have Fonta Gilliam from Sou Sou. They were a best of show winning company from Finovate Spring 2019. And if you haven't heard of the concept of a Sou Sou, don't worry. I hadn't heard of it either until the first time I heard Fonta speak, but it's a really interesting idea, and I'll leave it to Fonta to explain exactly what it is and where the idea comes from. As a reminder, we'll have just 7 minutes to chat today. You'll know our time is up when you hear that infamous Finovate bell sound. Let's go ahead and jump into the interview. Fonta, thank you very much for joining me and chatting with me today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So you know the rules. We've got 7 minutes to talk things through. Let's go ahead and get started with kind of a high-level overview of Sou Sou.
Sure. So Sou Sou is a fintech company. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we have two signature products for banks. The first is Sou Sou. The second is Sou Sou Capital Connector. We launched Sou Sou at Finovate, and so that's the one I'll probably be focusing on today.
Okay, great. So, Sou Sou is an interesting concept. It's one that I hadn't heard of before chatting with you, actually. Why don't you take a moment and just kind of tell us what a Sou Sou is, how you heard about it, and why you think it's a good model to follow?
Absolutely. And so let me start with the informal Sou Sou that a lot of people around the world are probably most familiar with, especially if you are from West Africa, countries like Ghana or Nigeria or the Caribbean. It's an interesting concept that really exists around the world. I was exposed to it as while working as an American diplomat for the United States government. During that time, I noticed, particularly in countries like Africa, also in Asia and Latin America, how people would be using informal savings and loan clubs as an alternative way to fund themselves when banks and investors weren't an option. I saw it in many different ways and cultures, and the word Sou Sou in particular really stood out to me because it was really kind of close to my personal heritage as an African American. But the concept essentially was a group of people come together, they decide to put money into a common pot, and that pot rotates.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's an example of what financial services really is at an absolute micro level, right? It's people looking out for each other and kind of taking care of each other. And obviously there's a need that's not being met by the financial services industry that is, these people are kind of taking upon themselves to create these clubs, these little communities. And I know you guys, as you started looking at this, you were initially looking at some of those unbanked, underbanked folks, but it also sounds like you sort of found a good target market in millennials as well. I don't think anybody would say that millennials are in the same kind of category of unbanked and underbanked that we typically think of when we hear those words. But on the other hand, it's also fairly true that millennials' banking needs are not being met. And
Sure.
So in that sense, are they potentially underbanked? Can we think of them as underbanked?
That is a great point. And, it's probably admittedly a first world kind of problem. But you're right. Here in the United States, when I came back to America and settled down, bought a house, I looked around my community and I said, wow, there are so many people like me, also a millennial, that are really struggling with finding the right type of capital for where we are in life. So many millennials struggle with high debt, for example, from college tuition, which might impact them when they graduate and impact their ability to buy a house or start a business. Oftentimes people get stuck into this really awful trap, and a lot of people don't think about how millennials are dealing with how they can build credit and things like that. And so, yes, 100% would agree with you that millennials could be grouped into that kind of underbanked space.
This is one of the things that I've always found fascinating about the concept of financial inclusion, or democratization of access to banking
Mm,
services, because there's obviously a really, a high need in certain parts of the world that are being ignored, but there's also, a backyard need as well. In the
yeah.
United States, there are people who, for whatever reason, aren't being as served by the financial services industry as they should be. And, we've seen that play out over the years at Finovate with people coming in and offering new investment products
Mm.
to average people who don't used to have access to them. That's not, unbanked in the way we think about it, but it is still providing a new product. It's giving them something that they couldn't do before.
No, it is. It is. And I think culturally, millennials across the board, but particularly in the United States, we really resonate to this concept of social banking, which isn't something that Invest Sou Sou invented. But it is a term that we use and have coined quite a lot because it really relates to kind of where millennials are right now. We grew up on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We're used to sharing our lives and our passions and dreams with not only our peers, but the general public, to be quite honest with you.
Sure.
And it's become a cultural thing for us. And I've always felt like it's a little strange that the financial services industry is probably the one industry that hasn't really figured out a way to embrace that really, key part of our culture as millennials.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly they're working on it. I
Yeah.
want to come back to something that you said at the beginning, though. Your time with the State Department. I think that's a fascinating background. It's not something that we see a lot on the Finovate stage, as you can probably imagine. And
Sure.
before we got on this call, you were talking about some of the training you've had where you literally had to face down angry mobs in different countries around the world.
That's true.
I just want to ask how that compares to the Finovate audience. Do you feel that training set you up well to be able to stare down a room full of bankers, venture capitalists, and folks like that?
In a word, yes. No, I mean, the bankers and investors at Finovate are awesome, super supportive, and were so incredibly supportive of what we were doing. We won Best in Show, which, was a huge honor for us. But yeah, it's working as a diplomat, they train you on how to deal with different types of people and different cultures that may have different perspectives than you. And sometimes that can be an angry mob. Other times it can just be, a curious group of people or an uncomfortable situation that you have to navigate through. And they trained me how to do that in a lot of different ways. And I have some kind of interesting stories behind that. If we have some time, but I think that, it definitely prepared me to walk on that stage at Finovate because we are, with Sou Sou, we are creating a new category in the financial services industry. It is new to a lot of Americans that might not have grown up with this tradition. And so, I have to be comfortable with getting in front of large groups of people and articulating our product and its value proposition and being passionate about it. And definitely learned that during my early days at the State Department.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just, I actually wish I could get that training. I don't find myself in front of angry mobs very often, but it would be prepared, I suppose. You just never know.
Be careful what you wish for.
We're coming up on the end of our time, so I just have one question to end on. And, now that you've seen both worlds, who makes you deal with more bureaucratic BS? The government?
That's too funny. That's too funny. I would say, honestly, if I had to be honest about it, would be the banks. That's awful. But,
it is awful, but it's the answer I was looking for. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it's totally the banks. I mean, there's a huge regulatory environment we have to deal with, rightly so. And banks oftentimes have to be very cautious when dealing with new technologies because they're dealing with people's money and trust. And on the same sense, you could argue that government does too, but I think that government, once you learn the system, you can kind of learn the bureaucracy and how to navigate it. What I found is every bank is different. And so we have to really be conscious around how we craft our message and our product offering to everyone that we talk to. And that makes it different, but it also makes it fun. So I have no complaints.
Well, that was very diplomatically phrased at the end. We give you full marks for turning it around from... Thanks again to Fonta for joining us. It was a fascinating conversation. If you liked what you heard, hit like and make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening, whether it's on SoundCloud, iTunes, or our own webpage. If you're interested in joining us at a future Finovate event, remember you get 20% off all ticket purchases with the code FinovatePodcast. Our next few shows will be Finovate Asia in Singapore on October 14th through the 15th, Finovate Middle East in Dubai, November 20th and 21st, Finovate Europe, which is moving to Berlin this year on February 11th through the 13th. And then we'll be returning to the United States for Finovate Spring 2020, which will be in San Francisco on May 27th through the 29th. If you're interested in getting involved as a presenter, sponsor, or attendee for any of those shows, please check us out at finovate.com for more information. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us on the Finovate podcast this week. Brought to you by the team behind Finovate and produced in association with Provoke Media. Make sure you tell your friends about the show, leave us a review on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to our show, and check out our upcoming events at finovate.com.